Okay, in this video I'm going to go over the instructions for your first paper. The PDF of instructions is kind of long, it's 7 pages, and that's because this is part instructions for this specific paper, but also tips for writing argumentative philosophy papers generally. So starting with the basic instructions. This is essentially a summary and evaluation of an argument kind of paper. So you're going to be summarizing and evaluating Joiner's argument. That's the core purpose of the paper. In doing so, you'll be making an argument, you'll be explicitly stating and developing support for a main claim. Remember our very general definition of an argument. An argument is any set of statements where you've got a conclusion and you've got support for the conclusion. In this case, your conclusion or your main claim or your thesis is going to be a claim about Joiner's argument. Either an evaluative claim of the overarching argument, it is good, it is bad for the following reason, or something like that, or you might have a claim about a particular premise, about the claim she makes about consensus gentium, or about the possibility of a definition of soup, or something like that. Okay, paper formatting. This is a short paper, 3 to 5 pages, and this is a suggested length. It is not itself part of the grading criteria. If you have a paper shorter than 3 pages, it's going to be difficult to meet the grading criteria, and that will be why it gets a low score, not because of the page count itself. As for going above 5 pages, the point here is this is what I'm expecting. I'm not expecting a 5+ page paper. If you are engaging with an argument carefully and developing reasons, then and it goes longer than 5 pages, that's fine. I don't have an upper bound. Just don't add a bunch of irrelevant, redundant stuff that doesn't actually serve the purpose of the paper. Okay, basic formatting instructions, and there's things to highlight here is it should have a bibliography page, an outline page, an argument map page, and a reflection page. All that's in the template. So if you click on this link here, it will prompt you to make a copy of a Google Doc, which you should do, and then add to your own Google Drive. And this is a template that you should use and make your own. So obviously replace it with your name and the date that you write the paper, give it your own title. This is dummy text. It's also general advice for writing a paper, but it's dummy text, so ultimately you should cut all this out and put your paper here. The bibliography, I have included the only thing that needs to be in your bibliography. You are encouraged to not use any other sources, but if you do use any other sources, whether you engage with them, cite them in the body of the paper or not, include them in your bibliography. And I've included templates for citing different kinds of texts. We're not concerned about the citation format in this course, but what does matter is that you are making it clear when you're engaging with sources, and that you include enough information that anyone, say me, could easily go find and read for themselves whatever you are referring to. Okay, the next page is a paper outline. So in the outline, you should have a bullet point for each paragraph. Think of it as a paragraph by paragraph outline. You can add additional structure to your outline if you want to identify sections or something like that, but what should go in it is what is the point of this paragraph, like what's its function in your paper, as well as the actual content of the paragraph, so the topic sentence and the key support for it. In an argumentative paper, your topic sentence is usually going to be a claim, perhaps a premise in an argument, perhaps an objection, and the point of the paragraph is to develop support for things you are saying, or hypothetically saying if you're considering an objection. You should have an argument map, specifically a color-coded argument map, and the argument map, since this is a paper that is evaluating Joiner's argument, the thing that makes the most sense to do is start with a map of Joiner's argument and you are allowed to just use mine if you want. You don't have to use mine. If you are using your own, which you did for homework 2, you should definitely use mine to clean up and revise yours. I saw lots of really good ones, and even so, there's still room to sort of clean up and revise them. So you can do that, or you can just use mine. That's fine for this paper. And then make sure that everything that's in the map of Joiner's argument is one color. And I included information about how to update the color of the boxes of your map, right? And then anything that you are adding to the map by way of an objection, or if you want to add sticky notes to, if it's not actually part of reasoning or objecting, make it clear what you are saying, adding to this conversation. Think of, from now on, our maps are potentially maps of a conversation. First, we just mapped what one person added to the conversation, Joiner. And later, when we're using more than one text, we'll try to get multiple arguments into one map so we have a conversation and kind of color code who's adding what to the conversation. And the important thing that your papers will do is you will add something to this conversation, whether it's an objection or a response to an objection or an additional argument or something along those lines. If you're not adding your own boxes to the map, you're not going beyond summary. Okay, so you should include that color-coded map in your paper, where, again, feel free to start with mine if you want to, color-code it, and then make sure that your own boxes are either just plain old default, no color, or choose a color if you want to have colorful boxes. And then finally, there is a checklist, annotation, and reflection questions section. So you should complete the checklist on the next page. You should annotate your paper following these instructions. And if these instructions refer to skills or jargon you're unfamiliar with, there are writing resources in Canvas on the home page, as well as I think I put them at the top of the modules page, that there's something called writing resources, and if, say, you aren't sure what is meant by a topic sentence, or a sentence level transition word, or a paragraph level transition, or signal phrasing, there's a writing resource in there for that. In general, for this paper, I'm definitely going to recommend perusing those writing resources and selectively choosing a few. Okay, and then there's a reflection section, and then here's that checklist from up here. So you can just add in an X to everything that you tried to do. And here is where you get the actual criteria and how it will be graded. So there's going to be points for following these instructions, the quality of the summary. Notice that is the highest point value. And here are the criteria for a good summary. They should match the handout of criteria and checklist I gave you when you revised your summary for homework 2. Quality of evaluation, where you go beyond summary, and then general quality of writing. So that's the grading criteria. Okay, that's the template. We're still on page 1 of the instructions. Okay, next page we have argumentative strategy. Again, this is meant to be advice for writing argumentative/philosophy papers in general, and so for the rest of this class. So to choose a good arguable main claim, arguable means you have a claim that people could reasonably disagree with, and that's why it's worth considering the arguments and sharing them, communicating them to other people. Right? So you want to choose a good arguable main claim. That's what that is. And a good arguable main claim is an answer to a good question, or it's a solution to an interesting problem. So being able to identify a good question is a way to come up with a really good main claim. What makes a good question? It can't be obvious what the answer is. It can't be something you can Google. It can't be something that nobody would disagree about. And it should be important in some way. Like we learn something, even if only in the process of reasoning through possible answers to the question. So it'll help to think of main claims as answers to questions, and it can help to know what your question is. Okay, I'm going to skim through this a bit. The other thing I want to highlight is that when you write a philosophy paper and lots of other kinds of argumentative academic papers, think of yourself as participating in a background conversation. Like I said with the argument map being color-coded, think of yourself as starting to map a conversation, and you're mapping who's added to what in terms of arguments and relationships between claims and conclusions. In general, think of yourself and the context of writing as participating in this larger background conversation. So your sources are not just support for your claims like you would for a fact. So I give the example here. If you wanted to make a claim about poverty statistics, you would find a reputable source of those statistics like World Bank, and then you would provide that and you put in parentheses World Bank, and that backs up your claim. But that's not how we use sources in a philosophy paper. Instead, our sources are other people who are in this conversation. They are people who've either offered interesting or well-developed or especially influential arguments that are worth either building on or critically examining. And so your task is to, 1, bring the reader into this background conversation. So you're going to have to present, say, Joyner's argument, and then you're also going to contribute to the conversation by engaging with the argument. Okay, so the next page digs into this idea that a good main claim is going to be the answer to a good guiding question. This is the same thing as saying, like, you're going to need a good prompt, right? So if you aren't already given a prompt for an argumentative paper, you should try to develop your own. And prompts are almost always, I guess it's probably not true to say always, phrased as questions, especially for argumentative ones. Unless you're told, like, you must argue X, explain Y. But that's not the kind of paper that we're writing. Okay, so there's 2 ways to think about your biggest guiding question for the paper. And either way you think about it, they're gonna sort of lead you in the same way. But here's 2 ways to think about it. One is you are writing about cereal, soup, the nature of food categories, or how words come to mean things, something like that. You have a big question. That's your guiding question. So maybe it's like, is cereal soup? That's Joyner's question, right? But you have the same question, and Joyner is just one of the people in the conversation. If you're going to write about his cereal soup, here is a person that you can sort of bring in as an example of an argument that's worthy of our time and interest and analysis. Alternatively, you could see yourself as writing about Joyner's argument, so that your big guiding question is it any good? Should we accept this? Is this the right conclusion to draw and for the right reason? Both of those are big questions, which can be helpfully narrowed down because this is a short paper. Well, shortish. Might not feel short to some people. So here are some narrower questions you could ask. These are essentially your prompts for the paper. So you would do well to just choose one of these as the prompt for your paper number 1. But the thing that I want you to sort of keep in mind as you're reading this is how can you apply this idea that you're trying to choose a big guiding question and there are ways of narrowing it so that you can use this kind of skill for a later paper. How do these narrow the question of is cereal soup? How could you have come up with any of these as your own prompt, right? That's something that's more difficult to do than just to respond to a prompt you are given. So try to think about that. But as far as this paper goes, just choose one of these as your prompt. Any one of them would be a particularly, I think, a fruitful prompt to follow. And if you have something if you want to write your own prompt for this paper, that's entirely an option. I definitely recommend that you reach out and discuss your prompt options with me if you're not going to use one of these. Okay, now that you have, presumably if you're getting to this point in actually writing the paper, chosen your prompt, your guiding question, and trying to figure out like what your actual answer to it will be, let's move on to the how do you communicate that? Essentially, how do you organize the paper? How do you build up to developing the main claim that answers your question? So one thing you can do, especially if you picked, my paper is about soup, and Joyner just happens to be someone I'm going to talk about along the way. You could lead with your argument or something, and then you could bring in other people if they raise something that you want to object to, or if they have a potential objection to your argument, something like that. You can lead by making your argument. Option 2 is you can lead with an argument from the background conversation. And so the first thing you're going to do is introduce a source, summarize that source as an argument to get us started with, and then you're going to engage with that argument, consider a possible objection, respond to that objection, ultimately figure out what we should believe about not just the final answer to the question, is cereal soup, but the questions we're forced to grapple with along the way. I'm going to recommend option 2 is for this kind of paper where it's really about summarizing and evaluating a source. This is the kind of structure that makes the most sense generally. This structure will often also make sense if you're focused on your own main claim. It often helps to start with something that already exists in the background conversation, so you can either contrast how you're doing it, or you can object to that and, again, maybe contrast how you're developing the argument. It often makes sense to start with somebody who's in the conversation, instead of just starting premise 1, premise 2, here's my own argument. Okay, I've got advice for writing the introduction as well as samples. So definitely read a couple of samples. These are all sample intro paragraphs from philosophy papers, so that'll be helpful. I also have tips for writing the conclusion. Check those out. And for academic integrity and citing your sources, like I said earlier, the only expected source here is Joyner. You are not required to use any other sources. I'd rather you didn't use any other sources, but if you do, include them in your bibliography. Here are some of the especially important sources that these are all in Canvas as well, but I've linked to them here. These are some of them you might get started with, but there are others. Don't forget, Mesa does have Zoom tutoring. Definitely recommend taking advantage of that. Here's the same criteria that we had at the end of the template. And finally, we have a sample outline, and this outline probably will make sense for most people's papers, but it depends perhaps on the prompt that you picked. This is a very basic outline. Feel free to change it. It's just supposed to give you an idea. And importantly, as I said down here, this outline is meant to indicate sections, not paragraphs. So definitely use the paragraphing writing resources if you are not confident in your paragraphing skills. And in any case, here are some basic paragraphing rules of thumb. Your paragraphs should generally be 1/2 to 1/3 of a page long, so 2 or 3 per page, double spaced in 12-point font. And it's not that length itself matters, although there is a sense of give your reader a break so they can sort of connect dots. But usually, if your paragraph is getting to be more than 1/2 a page long, you're making more than one point that is worth separating. So one main idea per paragraph. And for an argumentative paper, that's usually going to be a premise or an objection or something that's a part, like one of the branches of your argument map is going to be what goes into a paragraph. That's a general rule of thumb, not an exceptionless rule. Okay, that completes my overview of your Paper 1 instructions. And again, it makes sense to use my map, either substantially revise yours using map or just use my map as your map of Joyner. And you should absolutely do the mapping before you do the writing. It's not do the writing and then map your own argument. It's use the map in order to develop your thinking. Always do the thinking before you do the writing. That being said, writing is how you further develop your own ideas. Sometimes you don't realize until you've really written it out where you have something really interesting to say or where an interesting line of argument took shape. So you might map, you might write, you might go back and rewrite. It's an iterative process where you can go back and forth. So for that reason, I always recommend write your introduction first to give yourself a plan, but also revise it last to make sure that the introduction really does reflect what you ended up doing in the body of the paper. Okay, now that officially completes my overview of paper number 1.